Good evening, and thanks for joining us for the Courier Journal's coverage of Election Night 2020. I'm Kirby Adams along with Joe Girth, coming to you from the Courier Journal building in downtown Louisville. And we're joined tonight by a team of reporters from the Courier Journal, including political reporters Morgan Watkins and Joe Sanka, and executive editor of the Courier Journal, Rick Green. You know, we're going to get to everybody in just a moment, but Joe Girth, I have to ask you, in all your years of covering politics, have you ever experienced anything like what we're seeing right now?
You know, this is the damnedest election I've ever experienced. I mean, the people are voting from home rather than going to the polls. People were able to vote for weeks and weeks early. And so we really don't know how this is going to play out nationally and in Kentucky as far as getting votes in, especially the ones that arrive late, getting them counted. And so we may be waiting for a while to get the results in some of the most important races going on. Also, this is probably the biggest race for president that I've ever seen in my life, especially, at least as far as what we're seeing and the way that people are viewing this. It's really a culture war out there at this point. And it's the conservatives, the rights versus the liberals. And we've had battles before, but it's never been pitched like this.
I saw a poll today that said this is the most stressful day of the entire year for many, many people.
I don't doubt that. The Democrats have spent the last 4 years despising Donald Trump, hating the direction he has taken the country. On the other hand, the Republicans, especially the ones who are part of Donald Trump's base, have thought the last 4 years been the best years of their lives. And so when you have that, you've got a lot of stress.
Well, let's go ahead and take a look right now. The polls closed here in Louisville just about 35 minutes ago. Let's take a listen to what some of the voters had to say today as they went out to cast their votes.
They're out here to vote to show that they have a voice and to make, America great again, of course. But that's what we're here for.
Hopefully a lot more people are going to vote and make their voices heard, because I think that's been a lot of the problem, is that we don't feel heard of a lot of the liberal and more people of color and things like that. So yeah, we just want to make our voices heard. So I think that's what's contributing to it, the social injustice, honestly.
As long as everybody go by the Constitution, there shouldn't be no problems. You know, we're all humans. You either right or you're wrong. You good or you bad. Simple as that. That's how simple life is.
I was able to register to vote for the first time last year, right after I turned 18. I think it's really important for today's youth to be able to vote for their country, because a lot of people just don't care, and it's actually really so important that you vote, because this is your future, not just some adult political stuff, and I think it's very important.
What issues do you think are driving up the numbers in terms of people showing up in higher percentages than we've seen in the past?
Biden and Trump fighting like a bunch of babies. I feel like our country's in unrest right now, and that they're going to continue to pout when they don't get their way.
We are at a turning point. We've been at a turning point probably since Trayvon Martin was killed. But for sure, it's just like every day you wake up, every day you turn on the news, there's some type of injustice that's happening specifically against Black people. And so we're tired. We're tired of dealing with that. And so if that means we got to pound the pavement and we got to pound the polls, then that's what we're going to do.
And so now let's bring in Courier Journal executive editor Rick Green, because Rick, I know that you said you were going out to the polls today. You were waiting until Election Day to vote. And this, I believe, is your favorite day of the year?
Best damn day of the year, Kirby. It's nice to see everyone. Went out to Ballard High School bright and early this morning. Long lines. Things moved pretty quickly. And Joe, I think you kind of touched upon it yourself. Almost felt like a pre-football game kind of environment. People were enthused. People were chatting. People were, excited to be there. It's clear that this election, this long campaign, has resonated with a lot of folks, and I think Kirby, you and Joe both have kind of hit up on it. People were just glad to finally be able to go to the polls if you hadn't already cast a ballot, and we know that there certainly were tens of thousands of folks that did that, not only here in the Commonwealth, but certainly around the country, millions and millions and millions. But yeah, it was good to see democracy in action this morning.
Why did you wait until today to cast your vote?
There's something special about election day for me, Joe. You know, you and I are a couple of war horses. I've been covering elections, presidential elections since '88. And I certainly, God, I'm so admirable of the political act that was struck between the governor and the Secretary of State's office that allowed the early voting and the mail-in ballots and all the things that happened this year. But to me, there's just something magical about actually going in on that first Tuesday in November and casting a ballot, particularly in a presidential election. And it's my first presidential election here in Kentucky as well. I've been here for 2.5 years now, but obviously the first presidential ballot I got to cast and wanted to do it in person and do it on that day.
Okay.
The Courier Journal has a very long history, and politics is a very important part of what we do.
Yeah, you know, in less than a week, we turned 152 years old. And when you think about the legacy of that journalism, the meaningful work that's been done by not only the team that we have right now, but the generations that preceded us and those great journalists whose shoulders we stand upon, there's nothing that's more important in Kentucky, perhaps, other than Wildcat basketball, bourbon, occasionally some horses on that first Saturday in May, than politics. It's a contact sport, rough and tumble. And I feel that we have done an exceptional job, particularly this very difficult election cycle, which felt like it started, Joe, at least 2.5, 3 years ago.
Oh, it started 4 years ago.
It hasn't stopped.
Yeah.
And we've seen that obviously with the gubernatorial election from last November, which feels like it's been at least 3 or 4 years ago, Joe. But throughout this campaign, obviously Kentucky's not going to be highly contested. I mean, we pretty well know how the results will turn out tonight, at least at the presidential level. But as Joe, you and Chris Kenning discovered over 3 or 4 days last week, traveled 1,000 miles, 25, 30 different counties across the Commonwealth. There's great passion for this election and for politics in general here in Kentucky. I was just curious, was there one striking conversation that you had that really resonated with you the most?
It wasn't one, but what surprised me is on several occasions, people brought up Joe Biden's age, not mentioning Trump's age, which is, you know, they're both in their 70s, they're both pretty darn old. But several times people brought up Biden's age and mentioned that they didn't think he would be around very long, and that they thought that Kamala Harris would end up being the president. And for the people I was talking to, they weren't a big fan of that.
All right. Well, Rick, thanks for sending dinner into all of us that are here manning the cameras here at the Courier Journal building. We appreciate that.
Election night pizza. Yep, election night pizza, another tradition. I just want to tell our readers how much we've appreciated covering this campaign. Obviously, the hard work is behind us in many ways, but man, I'll tell you, for the next 6 hours or so, 7 hours, it'll be a complete sprint. I know you've got Joe Sonka and Morgan Watkins on. They'll talk a little bit more, but we've got at least another dozen or so reporters and journalists and 6 or 7 different editors that are online right now. We are all covering this election remotely, with the exception of the 4 or 5 that are there downtown. Since March, we've covered this community and the Commonwealth and this campaign remotely, away from our newsroom, working on breakfast tables and basements and cars and living room couches. We will do our very best to get as many of the results in Wednesday's paper. We know this is going to be a long night, so we won't be able to get all the final results in, certainly not the presidential final determination. Make sure you pick up Thursday's paper. It'll be crammed with all kinds of content, maps and graphics, and lots of analysis. But I really would encourage you to stay tuned to courierjournal.com. News as it happens, as each state is being called. And we also will have just great reporting and analysis as these races unfold tonight and possibly tomorrow morning. And maybe Thursday, Joe, who knows where it might all go. But good seeing you all. Good luck tonight, guys.
And hey, Rick, I want to jump in and say one thing. You mentioned that we know what the results are going to be pretty much in Kentucky. We don't expect any changes in the presidential vote in Kentucky than what we saw 4 years ago. And from the polling we've seen, there's really no reason at this point to suspect that Mitch McConnell's in any trouble. But the one thing that is hanging and that Kentucky voters will really be interested in, that it really affects Kentucky, is the fact that Mitch McConnell's leadership position is on the line in this election because the Republicans now hold a 53-47 lead in the Senate. But there are a lot of seats, Republican-held seats, that they're having to defend, and a lot of these are too close to call at this point.
You know, I think, and Morgan has got a fabulous story, and Kirby, I'll let you throw to her in a second or two. The biggest question tonight in Kentucky, as far as I'm concerned on the national level, isn't so much who's going to win on the presidential ticket or even in that Senate race, based on all the polling we see and traditionally how Kentucky goes. But to me, and Morgan, you know more about this, is the different scenarios in which McConnell will likely have to be operating come January. You know, whether or not the Republicans hold on to the Senate, what unfolds if the Democrats win, what happens if Trump somehow wins, but the Democrats win the Senate, all kinds of different scenarios. We have an analysis that as soon as the McConnell race is called for Morgan, that is just a really fabulous piece that looks exactly to what you're talking about, Joe. And I'm just curious, Morgan, you know, what's the biggest takeaway from tonight in terms of you're Mitch McConnell? What are you expecting him to be doing besides counting the votes here in Kentucky?
I think he'll be watching what's going on with the Senate races around the country really closely, assuming that he wins his own race. I think that's obviously the top priority for him, right, is whether or not he'll stay in the Senate for another 6 years. But, you know, he's said multiple times for months now that he thinks there's a 50-50 shot at the Democrats wresting control of the Senate away from the GOP. So for him, I mean, he's been pretty straight up about, yeah, you know, there's a 50-50 chance that I might not be majority leader again come January. So I would expect him to be keeping a really close eye, on what's going on in the battleground states where these Senate races are super close. And that may be a question that's left open for him and left open for the country for several days to come, maybe even weeks, depending on, you know, if Georgia's Senate races go to runoffs. That's going to be a huge question mark, maybe for a while.
Okay. All right. Well, Rick, thanks for joining us. You know, you have lots to do, lots to oversee from your home. We appreciate that. And Morgan, we're going to come back and talk to you in just a moment. But first, let's throw it over to Joe Sonka to talk some more about what's going to be going on in the Kentucky State House races and what you're going to really be looking at tonight. I guess it's night at this point. Put your mic on.
Thank you. Republicans have a 62-seat supermajority in the State House, and they're going to be looking to expand that, picking off 6 open seats where a Democrat chose not to run for election in districts where Trump did very well in 2016. So they're going to look to expand that majority in those rural seats. But Democrats are hoping to counter that by doing well in urban areas and especially suburban areas, which have started to trend more Democrat since Trump came into office. So they're trying to pick off seats like Jason Nemes's seats in Eastern Jefferson County, Kevin Bratcher, 2 Republican incumbents. They're also looking to take back a suburban seat in Lexington that used to be held by that was held by Stan Lee for 20 years. That's now an open seat. So they're all together. There are probably 24 races that could be very competitive, and we're not sure whether Democrats are going to try to end that supermajority, try to get them under 60 seats, or if Republicans are just going to keep expanding that further.
All right, thanks, Joe.
The way I look at it is there's not a Democrat in a rural area that's really safe, and there's not a Republican in an urban area that's really safe at this point. Am I pretty safe in thinking that?
I think that's a pretty safe assumption. The problem for Democrats is there's not too many urban areas in Kentucky. It's mostly a rural state. So if that's your base of support, then you're always at a disadvantage right there. And that's one of the reasons why they're a super minority, I guess, in the House, and even more so in the Senate, which is totally dominated by Republicans.
On the Senate side, what are you seeing there?
On the Senate side, the the same dynamics, the Chris McDaniel race, District 23 in Northern Kentucky. That's the northern part of Kenton County, which includes Covington, which is typically blue area, but also suburbs that traditionally are Republican, but have started to trend more Democrat. Andy Bashir was able to win this district by a pretty easy margin against Bevin last year. And I'm looking at the early returns right now, and Biden and McGrath are doing extremely well in Kenton County. There's about a third of the vote in that county, and Biden's got over 70% of the vote. If he actually wins Kenton County, that would be a landmark shift, and it would really show the suburban shift that's happening nationally, where suburban areas polls show that Trump is doing very, very poorly. And if that holds true and McGrath wins Kenton County and Biden wins Kenton County, that would be a good indicator for Democrats nationally that it might be a really good night.
All right, well, don't go too far, Joe. I know you can't. You're stuck in your house, but we also want to talk to Morgan here. Morgan Watkins, as we mentioned, has been covering McConnell and McGrath, the Senate race. Before we talk to you, Morgan, we want to go quickly to some video from yesterday when both candidates were out one last day of campaigning.
I believe in our democracy, and that's not a red or blue thing to say. You know, I've said this many times on the trail. I'm a Democrat. I'm very proud of that. I married a lifelong Republican. He's standing right there. You know, my parents were different political parties. I mean, you vote for the person, not the party. I just feel like we've got to get back to that. We've got to get back to what our country is all about, that you have campaigns, but at the end of the day, once an election's over, you work towards, in good faith, for the good of the country, for the good of Kentucky. Does anybody believe Senator McConnell does that?
Today and tomorrow are the most important days for us, because all indications are that the people who are going to vote for Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell will turn out in large numbers today and tomorrow. So don't run out of energy. Don't run out of energy. For us, the best is yet to come, in all likelihood, today and tomorrow.
Spent their Monday in Lexington and Versailles. Where were they today, and what were they doing?
Well, McGrath she made several stops around the state. She was kind of flying back and forth around. I think the last stop she had planned was in Georgetown, out in the Lexington area, kind of making one last stop. She is not having kind of a formal campaign event tonight that's open to the press. So, you know, we'll probably hear from her later, depending on if and when the race is called. Senator McConnell, he is actually does plan to have sort of a election night event tonight, which probably, checking the time, probably is getting underway around now. So we'll probably hear from him, I expect, from that event later tonight. But for them, really, you know, it was kind of, for both campaigns, you know, they really, especially over the last week, you know, Senator McConnell came home, was holding all these rallies around the state, including the one that he held yesterday out in Versailles. And so for them, I think today really was just kind of the goal for the campaigns, is just get out the vote. Anyone who hadn't voted, you know, trying to make sure they made it to the polls. And that's really what both of them and their campaigns were focused on today, was just kind of finishing strong.
How big were the events that the two candidates were having, given the coronavirus and all the social distancing that we're being told we should do?
The ones that I went to yesterday, the one that McGrath held in Lexington, that was probably around 60 people or so, and they were gathered outdoors in like the parking lot of a restaurant out in Lexington, and people were pretty socially distanced there, everyone wearing masks. Senator McConnell's, I honestly don't have a head count of the one that I went to yesterday. It was in an open air barn, but it was packed. I will say that, like, that barn had a lot of people in it. But I was up toward the front, but they've been the McConnell campaign has been pretty careful over the last week in terms of, they've been holding rallies in counties that are not red because of super high infection rates. Everybody at that barn and at the other campaign of his event of his that I went to, everyone's in masks. They do temperature checks at the door. So, and those were really, I mean, he hasn't had as many kind of out public events as McGrath has. Partly he's been in DC a lot. But McGrath and McConnell both seem to, try to at least have them in open air areas essentially, and masks have been pretty much non-negotiable at both of their events.
All right. Well, we know you have work to do. What we're going to do is we're going to thank Joe, Morgan, and Rick for joining us. We're going to take a break right now to gather more information on the votes as they're being counted. We'll be back here on Facebook Live and also at courierjournal.com starting at 7:30 and continuing every hour with more fresh information for you. So for now, for Joe Girth and myself, Kirby Adams, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you back here at 7:30.